It's easy to argue for Napoleon's greatness by pointing at the scoreboard. The man certainly did a lot of winning. Wars of the First, Second, and Fourth Coalitions, it's all quite impressive. But today we come to the fifth war in the sequence, and we're forced to ask that if Napoleon was such a dominant victor, why was he forced to return to the field of battle again and again? And the answer seems to be that in his quest to attain victory, he surrendered any hope of attaining peace. This is No One Is Competent. Welcome back to No One Is Competent, the show that refuses to die. How does it feel to be alive in 2024, Jay?
Pretty good, I'd say.
You know, you told me that you have fought off 17 attempts on your life in the last 2 weeks alone. Is that right?
Somewhere in there, yeah.
Yeah, personally, I've had the lizard people come after me, the alabaster Albanians, the bourgeoisie, the penguin fuckers. No one can take me down. I've had COVID, bovid, rovid, AIDS, lades. I've been fired. I've been hired. I've crawled through sewers. Nothing will stop me from making this fucking podcast. I'm not even on Adderall right now, and I'm already hyped on Spiked like a might bite. You understand what I'm saying?
I think so.
I may or may not have my desk in standing position for this episode. We are not relaxed today. Alright, I am on Twitter. I am at Azalea Wyatt. Or at Wyatt Azalea. Frankly, I forget. Doesn't matter. Jay is at Jaharis48. You can email the podcast at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. And yes, I have read your emails. And yes, we will get to those podcast suggestions probably next time, actually. But today we return to our eternal curse of making people care about the fucking French. Why did we decide to do this? They made an entire goddamn Napoleon movie in between our last two Napoleon episodes. You think about that, Jay?
I think the less said about that movie, the better.
All right, Jay, please take me from the world of dopamine and orgasms and happiness and beauty and return me to the freaking 19th century French hell of which we are bound like cursed ghosts.
I will gladly do so. You know, as you've all probably gathered by now, today we're returning to our series on the Napoleonic Wars by taking a look at the War of the Fifth Coalition, which was a brief but very intense conflict waged primarily between France and Austria in 1809. Now, our sources for this episode are Aspern and Wagram, 1809, A Mighty Clash of Empires by Ian Castle, The Battle of Wagram, but also by Ian Castle for Napoleon.org, The Napoleonic Wars, The Rise and Fall of an Empire by Gregory Fremont Barnes and Todd Fisher, and Napoleon Defeated Aspern 1809 and Napoleon's Revenge of Wagram 1809 by Epic History TV.
Yeah, that sounds like just the least official source I've ever heard in my entire life, but I do believe you. I am a man of great faith. My faith stacked is perked on jerked. Like, I have exceeded the soft cap.
I'm glad.
So we've been doing Napoleon a bunch, so we're gonna focus not just on the battles this time, but we're also going to get a little more like meta and widespread as to like what was going on in the era of the time, instead of just doing another, oh well, you know, some German Austrian fuckers got fucking wanted to throw hands, and then Napoleon threw hands, and he threw hands harder, and it's over. So Jay, where are we in 1809? What's going on? Ground us.
All right, so, in 1809, we've been through 4 of these wars already. Now, I know that the coalition wars do have a bit of a tendency to blend together in one's memory, so we can go through a very brief overview of these just to get up to speed.
Well, the first one is like kind of unique in my head, and then they start to run together a little.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, the first and second occur between 1792 and 1802. There's pretty much just a very brief interlude in 97 and 98. And these are what are also called the French Revolutionary Wars, because they come about due to the French Revolution. And these wars see France fight off a bunch of different powers, most prominently Britain, Austria, Spain, and Prussia. And then that would be the first coalition, and then Britain, Austria, and Russia in the second. Now, France wins both of these, which allows it to spread its sphere of influence in Europe. If these 2 coalition wars, the first 2, occur before Napoleon is the leader of France, though he would play a role as a military commander in both conflicts. In the aftermath of the War of the Second Coalition, Napoleon uses the popularity that he's gained to seize power, eventually crowning himself as emperor in 1804.
Yeah, and he's got all these like puppet kingdoms and small states across Italy and Germany and the Low Countries,
Yes.
and he's installing his relatives and friends as monarchs there. So you can kind of, group coalition wars first and second together, and the same thing you can pretty much do for the third and the fourth. And the following year would see France face Britain, Austria, and Russia once again in the War of the Third Coalition. This war would see the 2 most famous battles of the era, Napoleon's great victory at Austerlitz and the French Navy's great defeat at Trafalgar. Austria left the conflict shortly after Austerlitz, but the war continued on, evolving into the War of the Fourth Coalition upon Prussia's entry into the coalition in late 1806. Remember, kind of the unifying theme of all of the coalitions is the failure for the coalition forces to work together, and so instead of France having to fight so many opponents at once, generally they really only have to fight one at once, knock them out, move on to the next one, and that makes it much easier, right?
Yes.
The War of the Fourth Coalition would end in a crushing defeat for Prussia and a substantially less humiliating defeat for Russia, because it wasn't really on Russia's soil. This meant that by 1807, Napoleon had seemingly achieved complete mastery over continental Europe. All of Europe's great powers, save for Britain, had been humbled by the French army, and France's network of client states extended beyond the natural borders of France to cover much of Italy, Germany, and extended as far east as Poland.
Given the numerous victories won by France throughout the first 4 coalition wars, one has to wonder why the other powers of Europe kept on coming back for more. Now, to be fair, some of them didn't, at least not for every conflict. Spain, for example, switched to becoming a French ally partway through the War of the First Coalition, and Prussia sat out the Second and Third Coalitions altogether. The outbreak of these wars was not solely the result of the desire to crush the French Revolution and restore the Bourbon monarchy, as it is so commonly believed, but also as a response to aggressive French foreign policy. This in turn sparked a desire on the part of the great powers of Europe to limit French power, and a belief that such a result could eventually be achieved if they just had the right combination of forces at the right time. Of course, it is impossible to talk about the Napoleonic Wars without discussing the role Napoleon himself played in causing them. Napoleon is naturally pretty much blameless for the First Coalition, because he's just barely an officer in the army when it broke out. He did play a major role in its conclusion, however, by serving as the French representative during the negotiation of the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria. Now, the terms of this treaty would set the tone for much of Napoleon's future diplomatic efforts. Austria was forced to cede all of their possessions in the Netherlands, and give up the leading role they played in Italy. While this isn't the harshest of treaties, the loss of territories that had for centuries been under Habsburg influence was undoubtedly a bitter pill to swallow. It is thus of little surprise that Campo Formio would go on to be Napoleon's first failed treaty, lasting little more than a year before the outbreak of the War of the Second Coalition.
And this, reminds me, as you just told the story, that Napoleon just so brutally swallows the history here. When we were doing our parts in the French Revolution and the First Coalition, we had such a diverse cast. We had Girondins and the Abbé Sieyès and Robespierre and all these guys. And some of them die, but a lot of these politicians are around. They've just been sidelined for Napoleon and his marshals.
Yep, pretty much.
And I think a lot of it is historians posthumously doing this, but he did in many ways just sort of swallow this period, and it made it all about himself. And I feel like if you look at his diplomacy, you can see who Napoleon really is, because his military tactics only say so much. He was very, very good at them, but wars are not states.
Yeah, very much so.
So as Napoleon's role in the French military and political structure grew, so did his importance to French foreign policy. Unfortunately for both France and Napoleon himself, the soon-to-be emperor had three main flaws that would go on to plague French diplomacy throughout the era. The first was that on a personal level, Napoleon was, how do we say this, an asshole. He was difficult to get along with. He was certainly capable of both friendship and love, and he excelled at winning over both soldiers and civilians. But when, that's like speeches and stuff. When actually interacting with colleagues and counterparts, he typically came off as arrogant and overly aggressive. Napoleon's ego often led him to view these people as little more than instruments for his own grander vision, a view that he often failed to hide from them. For those of y'all who don't remember when we introduced Napoleon, this is a guy who, when he was, in his early 20s, is, basically their version of a weeb. He's quoting Cicero, and he's, a huge Roman history buff. This dude is a fucking nerd, all right? This guy is chuny as shit, as we would say, and he's got this giantly overflated ego by, all you need to know about Napoleon is that he had himself named consul before he was named emperor. There's no other piece of information that is important. All right, that's all you need to know. How do you get a beer with that guy? You don't.
Indeed. Now, the second real problem that he has is that he often seeks to impose what were for the day pretty harsh terms on France's enemies. Warfare in Europe before the French Revolution had largely taken the form of what would be described as cabinet wars. These wars were generally characterized as being limited in both scope and outcome, at least in Europe itself. Entire colonies might get exchanged from one nation to another in peace treaties, but borders in Europe tended to shift very little. I mean, think of the 7 Years' War. You look at it on paper, it looks like this massive climactic war. And then you look at the results and huge amounts of territory in the colonies are exchanged, but there's not a big impact to everyday life in Europe.
And that was a shift from the 1600s where Europe was completely torn apart by wars.
Yeah.
The 1700s, the ruling class of Europe had kind of be all right, we're gonna go fucking nuts over there, but when we come home from Thanksgiving dinner, everyone's gonna be civil.
Yes.
And Napoleon's no, I'm not civil. I can beat all you people, and I'm gonna fucking do what we did in the 1600s.
Yeah.
Which involved a lot of people getting fucking killed.
Yeah. And a lot more territory being exchanged. At the end of the War of the Fourth Coalition, Prussia is stripped of nearly half of its territory and forced into paying significant reparations. Napoleon likely thought that by seeking harsh terms, he could prevent future conflicts, basically, just intimidation, but this wouldn't really work out all that well.
And very, very luckily, though, Napoleon's lesson of the French defeating the Germans and then imposing super harsh penalties in an attempt to make a war not happen again, that not happen again, that luckily would be a lesson learned from history and would not be repeated.
And finally, Napoleon's seemingly limitless ambition and willingness to take risks, traits that were key to his rise to power after all, frequently led to him taking actions that jeopardized the chance for a more lasting peace. This can be seen as early as Napoleon's failed invasion of Egypt in 1798, which was an ill-conceived adventure that would play a major role in starting the War of the Second Coalition.
Dude fucking nat 20'd like 17 rolls in a row. Like, he should have died in Egypt. There's no... I still cannot fucking believe that happened and then everything was just fine. Like, it's just the most absolute Tom and Jerry ass fucking shenanigan. And then he gets back home and just and like half the work's been done for him. And then he just gets handed the fucking like country on a silver platter. Like, all right, Napoleon, who was a skilled man, like he was good at things. I'm not taking that away from him. But the amount of luck, like Bill Gates level of luck, is just obscene.
Yeah. Actually, I guess he does rank alongside one of his idols, Julius Caesar, in that regard. If you read about
Fair.
Caesar, up until
Fair.
the whole getting stabbed by the Senate thing, Caesar was incredibly lucky for most of his life. But yeah. In some other examples, you have the seizure and execution of the Duke of Enghien. This is when the French basically send like the cavalry into a neighboring and neutral German state to abduct a nobleman who was plotting against Napoleon and bring him back to France and kill him. This pisses off a lot of nobles throughout Europe, especially in Russia. In 1805, during the War of the Third Coalition, he straight up just marches through neutral Prussian territory, just hoping that the Prussians aren't going to go to war, and they don't until later. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course we did an entire 2 episodes on all the misadventures in Haiti.
Yeah. Which, I mean, that also, sparks a lot of Britain's hatred of Napoleon because they see him as, trying to expand into the colonies and whatnot. But yeah. Again, it would be a mistake to hold Napoleon as solely responsible for the wars of this period. France's enemies were often just as keen to march to their own defeat out of a misplaced confidence in their own ability. Most notably seen in the form of the grandiose expectations of the Prussian court during the Fourth Coalition. Britain remained interminably opposed to France out of fear of French domination of the continent, and was thus more than willing to encourage and fund any government willing to take up arms against Napoleon. Britain is basically like bankrolling all of these wars. That being said, the eventual outbreak of the War of the Fifth Coalition was in large part brought about by a decision Napoleon made that exemplified his worst traits, that being the occupation of Spain in 1808.
Now, that was episode 48 of the No One Is Competent podcast, so we're not really going to go into detail on the Peninsular War. In short, Spain was an ally of France since 1795, but the Spanish government was viewed as archaic and backwards by Napoleon and his advisors, because it was. Napoleon used the invasion of Portugal in 1807 as a pretense to move troops into Spain. The troops there would be used to seize control of the country and force the abdication of the Spanish king. In his place, Napoleon installed his brother Joseph as king, but the situation in Spain slipped into a state of war pretty much immediately because, people don't like it when you coup them for some reason, and he didn't understand that. It's not hard to see why Napoleon's move to overthrow an allied country and install his own brother as king strengthened the view around the ever-great powers of Europe that Napoleon possessed an insatiable lust for power. Meanwhile, French military setbacks during the Peninsular War gave new hope to the idea that Napoleon could in fact be stopped, and that this hunger could be prevented from consuming all of Europe. I can't help but think of this in a class context. You have all of these nobles in all of these countries seeing a guy who, is from Corsica or something, like, essentially trying to create a new nobility. In many ways, like, since Oliver Cromwell, essentially the first modern dictator. And that is a threat to the monarchical system of government that all of these people draw their power from, and thus needs to be crushed.
Yeah.
In a direct power struggle, a class struggle.
Yeah, like one thing you'll see, especially in like Prussia and Russia, it's a lot of like the middle and upper middle nobility that really hate Napoleon. And a lot of that probably does come from the whole class angle. Like, Napoleon is technically of noble birth, but like the Bonaparte family is like one step above commoners in their view, in the view of like proper European nobles. So like they're nobodies.
So he attacks their view of themselves in the cosmic and, to be clear, religious order. Like, these people believe that they have been divined by Christ to rule over the peasants, and Napoleon is a challenge to that, and thus gives them a lot of existential dread. Now, after Britain, Austria had proved to be the most persistent of France's enemies throughout the wars of the 1790s and early 1800s. Is Austria still led by the Habsburgs at this point?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is like the oldest of the monarchical families that Napoleon is challenging, right? Austria played a leading role in the first three coalitions, but their defeat at Austerlitz would prove to be a turning point in Habsburg history. The subsequent Peace of Pressburg saw the Habsburg crown recognize all gains made by France throughout the coalition wars, give up most of their remaining German and Italian holdings to French client states, and pay an indemnity of 40 million francs to France. I have no idea how much that is, but I assume it's a lot.
It's a pretty decent amount, and Austria is also like perpetually bankrupt throughout these wars. So yeah, it's not fun for them.
Shortly after Pressburg, Emperor Francis dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, and Napoleon declared his creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, essentially seeing France assume the position of the dominant power in the German states from Austria. So, like, the people who are in charge of the German states mostly don't even speak German now. And the Holy Roman Empire, that was around for, what, Jay, 800 years, depending on how you clock it?
Yeah, it's about right.
Is gone now. And we can drop all of those arguments about whether or not it's Holy Roman or an empire. Doesn't matter anymore.
Voltaire can stop getting flamed by, like, weird Habsburg fanboys on Twitter.
Like, it was a troll. Like, if you respond to him, you are letting him win because Voltaire was a troll. He wasn't a super, super smart guy, but he did understand trolling.
Yeah. So yeah, Austria's repeated defeats on the battlefield had made it painfully obvious that the Austrian military was in need of serious reform and modernization. Now, this was clear even before 1805, but the questions, were revolved around what kind of reforms were necessary, how long they would take to be implemented, and who should be in charge of carrying them out. Now, back then, the guy who came out on top was a general named Karl Mack von Lieberich. We talked a bit about him in the Third Coalition episode, and he basically promised that victory could be assured through very quick and simple organizational changes. Now, Mack, spoiler alert for something we've already talked about, gets utterly crushed during the War of the Third Coalition, and this means the guy who's his main rival, Archduke Charles, is now able to assume control over the military establishment.
So yeah, Charles is a character I've seen a few times. I remember, respecting him as much as you can respect any of these, noble fuddy-duddies. I cannot wait to see my opinion of him tarnished by what comes next. I have not read ahead a ton, but let's see how he does, Jay. All right. So Charles is on the sidelines of a bunch of these wars, watching this shit go bad, and he's like, there's got to be a better way. Was he correct?
We'll find out. Now, Charles is born in 1771 as the third son of the future Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II. Now, given that Charles has two older brothers, and that his father Leopold himself has an older brother, this will be Emperor Joseph II, who's only emperor for a few years before dying, Charles is pretty remote from the throne. Nobody really expects him to assume the position of emperor, and indeed he does not. Now, like many Austrian aristocrats, Charles pursues a career in the military, entering service in the 1790s, which happens to be just in time for the wars of the French Revolution. Now, given the highly nepotistic nature of the Austrian army, Charles is assured the rank of Major General basically just because he's an Archduke. That is literally just a privilege of his birth. Unlike many of the other aristocrats who made up the army's leadership, however, Charles would quickly prove himself to be a genuinely capable leader. During the tail end of the War of the First Coalition, he's able to defeat the French armies under Jean-Baptiste Jourdan and Victor Moreau and drive the French back across the Rhine. At the start of the War of the Second Coalition, he was again able to win multiple battles against the French before being forced to withdraw from the fighting due to poor health. During the run-up to the War of the Third Coalition, Charles had been a member of the Peace Party in the Austrian court, basically arguing that it was too early for Austria to go to war with France again. This position meant that when Francis did decide to go to war, Charles was kept on the sidelines, tasked with commanding forces in Italy, while the main theater would be in Germany. Now, this ends up being a bit of a blessing for Charles because he avoids being crushed by Napoleon at Ulm and Austerlitz. So by 1806, Charles is in his 30s, and this is when he's given basically complete control over the military by his older brother Francis, who is now Emperor Francis I of Austria. So Charles now finally has the authority he needs to carry out a series of reforms. Most of these center around streamlining the ponderous Habsburg military structure, improving the logistical training of the army, and copying the French corps system. He'll also institute a lot of new conscript units and kind of copy a lot of the French tactics for using mass conscript formations, like having very dense formations of men. Now, that being said, the promulgation of these reforms would prove to be slow. Not all of these are going to be in place by the time of the Fifth Coalition, and that's because a lot of the other Austrian generals don't really like him. Most of them are much older than Charles. Like, most Austrian generals are in their 60s. A lot of them see Charles as just like this young guy who's outranking them because he's the emperor's brother, which, in fairness, is kind of true.
Yeah, but in fairness, they also lost all of those coalition wars, so shut the fuck up.
Yeah, and also, like, the funny thing is that Emperor Francis doesn't really trust Charles all that much. He sees Charles as being a bit too politically involved, like having these ideas about running the state. Napoleon actually considers offering Charles the title of Holy Roman Emperor after the War of the Third Coalition. Charles turns it down, but like when news of this reaches Vienna, that also makes Francis kind of fear Charles even more. He thinks that Charles might have, aspirations to seize the throne. So Francis never fully trusts him.
But he gives him control of the military.
I mean, again, like, all the other prominent Austrian generals have failed pretty miserably. Charles does have the best track record of fighting the French. Like, he's won multiple battles against the French.
I mean, like, listen, Francis has got, 900 years of inbreeding scrambling his brains. Maybe I'm judging too hard.
Fair.
Given the slow pace of military reform, Charles was against going to war with Napoleon. Initially, this point of view prevailed, but the outbreak of war in Spain in 1808 gave a new wind to the party in Vienna. It's only been 2 years, people! By crowning Joseph as King of Spain, Napoleon had shown his ambition to dominate even more of Europe. Even Charles admitted in a letter to Francis that, quote, "Now we know what Napoleon wants. He wants everything." If Napoleon's occupation of Spain caused fear amongst the court in Vienna, France's military difficulties in the Iberian Peninsula gave them hope that now was the time to avenge the losses of 1805. As the military situation continued to grow tenuous, Napoleon was forced to withdraw most of his forces that were stationed in the German states to reinforce the French army in Spain. This, combined with the general exhaustion of the French army, which was still recovering from the harsh campaigns in Eastern Europe against the Russians, convinced many people that Napoleon had perhaps fatally overextended his forces. Remember, folks, this is before trains, railways, so like moving these armies around, even though they're just moving around continental Europe, is literally exhausting.
Yeah. Yeah, these are marching from all the way from Germany to Spain.
Feelers were sent out from Austria to Britain and Prussia, seeking cooperation in the war against France. Britain, which was already at war with France, promised financial support and floated the idea of amphibious landing in the Low Countries. Prussia also initially promised support to the Austrians, though would later back out of this agreement. Russia, meanwhile, was obliged by treaty to aid France, but in secret promised Austria that if war was to break out, they would act intentionally slowly and avoid conflict with the Austrian army. So, in early 1809, a decision was made by Francis and his advisors to go to war with France once more. In spite of his own reservations, Archduke Charles was now tasked with leading his army against that of Napoleon. He's had a few years to fix up the Austrian forces, and now let's see how well he can drive it.
So the Austrian plan of attack was simple. 8 of their 11 army corps would be used to launch a powerful thrust into Bavaria, Bavaria being one of France's main allied states in Germany. In doing so, Charles hoped to catch the French off guard and perhaps even precipitate anti-French revolts amongst the German states. 2 of the remaining corps would be used to launch a diversionary attack into Poland, and the final one would enter northern Italy. Britain, meanwhile, made preparations for an invasion of continental Europe, initially intending on landing in northern Germany, before the target was switched to Antwerp in Belgium, basically because Antwerp is a big French naval base. Preparations would be slow, however, preventing this attack from occurring alongside Austria's offensive.
So question, what's like the goal here? Like, are we trying to get the French out of the German sphere of influence? Are we trying to get the French out of Spain? Like, this kind of like always seems to be one of the problems, is that like, I feel like if the coalition like focused on something like, we're going to take back Bavaria, they might be able to do it, but
you're not really wrong. The focus seems to really just be like, yeah, let's
go get them, boys.
Kind of, you know, blitzkrieg before blitzkrieg is a thing. Let's try to like bum rush into Germany and, you know, take some land and maybe defeat Napoleon in a battle. And then like we can then negotiate, and because Napoleon will be in a weaker position, we can renegotiate a new treaty and get like some of the land we lost back.
Again, the whole point of this podcast is the thing. There's a lot of great history shows out there, but what most of them do not emphasize when they're talking about like, oh, look at the cool combat formations and all these genius tactics, and look at the gear and shit, is like emphasizing that an average 8th grader would look at this plan and be like, but why though?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, a factor of the decision to go to war is literally just like sunken cost fallacy, where this big army, once they mobilize it, they're like, oh, well, we can only pay to keep it in the field for like so many months. So, you know, if we don't use it now...
This is why soccer had to be invented. Like, this is why we have football in America. Like, you watch your team lose, there's the off season, you grumble, and then next fall, the cycle starts again, and we get this out of our system. All right? These people need better sports. Like, literally, they're like, yeah, we had a war 2 years ago. This was the off season. Now we're going back in. It's like the exact same fucking thing. So to recap, the Austrians are going to bum rush into Bavaria with a few diversionary attacks in Poland and northern Italy, just to kind of like keep them off the main attack into Bavaria. And like maybe Britain will show up in Antwerp, Belgium, like at some point, possibly.
Yes.
What are the French going to do?
So the first reports that Austria was mobilizing for war reached Napoleon while he was still attempting to evict the British from Spain in late 1808. If you remember back to the Peninsular War episode, the British sent a small force to Spain, and right now Napoleon's basically just chasing them across the length of Spain. Now, the Peninsular War had left his positions in Germany undermanned and at risk of encirclement, making a quick response on the part of the French Emperor a necessity.
And remember, y'all, like, again, no railroads at this point. So, like,
yeah.
Austria, it's very hard for them to, like, mobilize all their troops, like, in secret.
Oh, yeah, it's impossible.
There's a great video recently by Sean Munger on YouTube about the July crisis. And he goes into, like, for 10 minutes talking about how troops were drawn up for war and mobilized in, like, Austria and Russia and France and how, you know, everyone had a little book, and the book told them like what train station to be at and whatnot, and how it was this big organized thing, took a long time. And he was talking about World War One when there were trains.
Yeah.
No trains. Yeah.
So
this is like even more like chaotic and hard. And so like this is partially why like it's difficult for these coalitions to coordinate, because the technology is not there. This is before even the telegraph was a thing. And, like, you just kind of have to, like, get your boys and go and hope that they are slower at getting their boys.
Yeah. The French do have a pretty cool message system, like, within France, where they basically just have, like, it's called a semaphore. They have towers at regular intervals, and they can use signals and send messages pretty quickly.
That's pretty dope.
But even that's like only within France itself. Yeah. So this means that, you know, Napoleon figures out about the mobilization, and by early 1809, he's back in Paris, issuing a flurry of orders to his generals to raise new troops and reinforce French positions in Germany. Now, he realizes by now that war with Austria is going to happen, but he fails to grasp the pace at which the Austrians are putting their plan into action. Part of this is because he expects that the Austrians are going to formally withdraw their ambassador from Paris before the war begins. That was something that typically was done, but the Austrians don't do that. So Napoleon basically thinks that the Austrian military is not going to be able to launch an attack before mid-April at the earliest.
Which made it very awkward when Austrian units began their advance towards Bavaria in March of 1809. Their progress hindered by unusually strong springtime storms, though. The intense rain also caused confusion on the French side, such as Marshal Berthier, the French commander in Bavaria, had difficulties in mustering his forces and interpreting the slew of orders coming in from Paris. The Austrian army crossed into Bavaria on April 10th, a week before Napoleon expected. The emperor was already on his way to Germany, however, arriving in the French headquarters on... Okay, how do you pronounce that word?
Donauwörth.
I was not going to guess that. Donauwörth on the 17th. So, like, again, just to talk about we were talking about, like, the timing of whatnot, like, they're like, all right, let's, like, invade in, like, late 1808, and, like, now it's like 4 months later, and like now we're invading. It's just what the technology was back then. Napoleon was too late to support Marshal Davout's Third Corps, which found itself almost completely trapped against the bank of the Danube River by Charles' forces. Davout's corps was able to fight off an Austrian advance at the Battle of Tingenhansen on April the 19th. There is no way I pronounced that correctly. And they bought themselves enough time to escape encirclement and join up with Napoleon's larger force. Stan, Jay, this is like the most successful retreat I've ever heard of in my entire life. Like, Usually it's like, oh, we made it out alive. And it's like, yeah, sure, you losers. But like, yeah, they kind of like got attacked by a much larger army and were just kind of able to like running battle get back to a better position.
Yeah. Marshal Davout is often ranked as the best of Napoleon's marshals, and this is kind of an example why. He does very well in almost all the battles he participates in.
Yeah, so Charles got the early attack advantage, but was not able to take down even a single corps. And now with forces gathered in Bavaria, Napoleon went on the offensive. The French and their Bavarian and Saxon allies defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Absenberg on the 20th of April, driving a wedge between the northern and southern portions of the Austrian army. Again, this is just like classic Napoleon bold tactics. He's like, I'm going to plunge directly into the belly of the beast. Damn the consequences. Napoleon then pursued the southern portion towards Landshut, capturing the town on the 21st before swinging north to face the main body of the Austrians and defeating them at Eckmühl on the 22nd. The French had won 4 victories in 4 days, leaving Charles with no choice but to abandon Bavaria and retreat back to Austria. Damn, they do not make wars like that these days.
No. So yeah, this whole let's invade Bavaria thing is undone in 4 days. So yeah,
it took 4 months to do it and 4 days to undo it.
So yeah, facing the setback, Charles abandons the invasion of Bavaria and retreats back towards Vienna. Now, the Austrian army is now moving mostly along the northern banks of the Danube. If you don't know what the Danube kind of looks like, look at a map.
This is a river, by the way, just to be clear.
Yeah, very big river, a very important river. It kind of it's running mostly west to east in this part of Europe. So you can imagine that the Austrians are marching kind of west to east along the north of it.
The Danube is like the Mississippi River for Central Europe. It's a little smaller, but it's very big. It's very important for all the shipping and whatnot.
Yeah. So yeah, the Austrians are marching along the north and the French are along the south. Now this means that the French are able to make it to Vienna because Vienna is on the southern bank of the Danube in early May. Now, Charles and Emperor Francis decide to not defend the city, and instead the Austrian court evacuates, joining up with the army to the north. After a minimal amount of fighting, the city surrendered to the French on May 13th. For the second time in 4 years, French soldiers were now in possession of the great Habsburg capital.
I kind of wonder, like, if any of the French soldiers, I imagine a not insignificant amount of them were there the first time. They're like, I remember that, that coffee shop.
Yeah, staying in the same hotels. So yeah, up to this point, things are going very good for the French.
Great, I'd say.
Sure, they'd been caught off guard, but they had responded quickly, won multiple victories, and were now in possession of the enemy's capital city. In an earlier war, this probably would have been enough to end the conflict. At this time, however, the Austrians were determined to defeat the French. Charles' forces had been defeated, but at each battle they had managed to retreat in good order, preserving the bulk of their strength. His army now regrouped to the north of Vienna, preparing for their next battle with Napoleon. They wouldn't have to wait long.
Now, would you say that part of the reason that the Austrians were able to retreat successfully is because of those reforms put in by Charles, the reorganization, the corps, the whatnot?
Yes, I would definitely say so. The Austrians, just like their handling of units, how they're able to maneuver and whatnot in this war, are better than in the previous campaigns. And Charles is also generally pretty careful to make sure when he goes to battle that like he has a plan B or like lines of retreat and whatnot planned out. Yeah. So, the Austrians are losing these battles, but they're not getting wiped out. They're taking some casualties and then pulling back.
It's important to remember, guys, that wins and losses are not like like tallies on a board. They're weighted, and like in most battles, it's not like Civ 5 where like two armies just smash heads into each other until one of them is completely obliterated. Like
Yeah.
a battle might take place, and the losing side might face 3 to 5% casualties, and that's enough to get them to want to go fight another day, because people don't like dying generally.
Yeah.
And telling people to stay and die for the cause is a really great way for them to not want to do that. And the way you actually defeat an army, is to cause a rout. And a rout only happens when people just start breaking and running. That happens when discipline breaks down, when communication breaks down, where people don't know where their officers are, where people's officers are dead. And so if you have a system where soldiers are well organized, they're well communicated with, there's officers that know what they're doing, that are communicating up, down the chain of command, and keeping everybody calm, things can go bad, but you're still together.
Yes.
Now, before we get back to Charles, let's take a look at some of those other fronts. First, in Poland, a much smaller Austrian force under another Austrian Archduke, Ferdinand Karl Joseph, had marched into the French allied Duchy of Warsaw. I don't think Poland's actually a proper country at this point in history.
Yes, the Duchy of Warsaw is the official name for, what we call like the Polish state. This was set up by Napoleon after the previous Poland had been swallowed up by Prussia, Russia, and Austria.
That trend of Poland being chopped up and fought over, fortunately for them, would continue for quite a while. So Ferdinand's assault initially went well, with the Austrians capturing Warsaw by the end of April. This was largely because the Polish commander, Józef
Poniatowski, I think. Something like that.
Poniatowski, had chosen to give the city up to the Austrians, forcing them to overextend their lines. The Polish then proceeded to harass the Austrians in a series of skirmishes. Quite smart. Russia, bound by treaty to France, entered the war on the side of Napoleon. Unbeknownst to Napoleon, the Russian Tsar had agreed to avoid conflict as much as possible with the Austrians. Remember, we said that before. And thus the Russian army moved intentionally slowly into Poland. This did cause trouble for Poniatowski, who was forced to dispatch soldiers to safeguard the Polish countryside from being plundered by his ostensible Russian allies. Fun.
Now in Italy, the situation also starts off well for the Austrians, with Archduke John, this being Charles's younger brother, defeating French forces under the command of Napoleon's stepson Eugene. Eugene, however, is able to reverse the situation, pushing the Austrians out of northern Italy and back into the Habsburg heartland. We'll come back to John later because he will play or not play a fairly important role.
Don't read ahead. We'll tell you. All right, so not a ton of good news for the Austrians, but Charles, he's looking to make his comeback. He knows he can do it. Where is he going to try to do it?
Yeah. So by the middle of May, Napoleon is, residing comfortably in the Grand Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. The French emperor had little time to rest, however, as Charles's army remained to the north of the Danube. In order to pursue the Austrians and force them to battle, Napoleon would first have to get his army across the Danube. Unfortunately for him, the Austrian army had blown up the bridges spanning the river prior to evacuating the city. More fortunate were French intelligence reports that pointed towards the main body of the Austrian army no longer being in the vicinity of the river. If all that the French would face were a few scattered Austrian units, a forcible crossing of the river would be possible.
Remember, back to the technology level of the period. River crossings are still very, very difficult, but they can be done. Now, can you do them while getting shot at by cannonballs? Yeah, less. So he's going to be vulnerable while this goes down. And this would eventually evolve into the famous Battle of Aspern Essling. Day 1. Napoleon's plan was to cross from the southern bank of the Danube to the island of Libau, from where the army, with 75,000 men and 125 guns, would then cross over to the northern bank of the river. So you got a little checkpoint. On May 18th, the French began to construct pontoon bridges for this purpose. French troops under the command of Marshal Massena crossed over May 20th, quickly occupying the villages of Aspern and Essling that lay near the banks of the river. They encountered no resistance, lending credence to the idea that the main Austrian army had retreated further from the river. In reality, the situation was far from what the French had in mind. Archduke Charles and his army of roughly 99,000 men and 292 guns were mere miles from Aspern Essling, and the Austrians had noticed the French crossing. The opportunity was obvious. If the Austrians could interrupt the flow of French soldiers over the Danube, they could then defeat the French forces that had already made it across, divide, and conquer. The Danube is often a deceptively fast-flowing river. Quick history check, Jay. Can most of Napoleon's troops swim at this time in history?
No.
Yeah! So that shit is death.
Yeah.
And this is like, it's May, so it's not like freezing. It is cold enough that, like, if you're, like, way down with gear, you fall in this shit, like, the shock, it's moving fast, you can't...
Yeah.
You're out. You're done.
From what I understand, it was a relatively cool, like, spring in this particular year.
Yeah, you're out. You're done. If you've never been thrown in a 70, 60 degree body of water, it's a shock to your system on the best of days. So again, the Danube is a fast-flowing river, and remember we mentioned there were those heavy rains earlier this year, and you had a lot of alpine snow melt in 1809. The Austrians used this to their advantage by tossing large, buoyant debris, barges, timber, torn-up building frames, into the river upstream of Libau. As bits of debris made it down the river, they smashed through the French pontoon bridges, forcing the French to halt their crossings repeatedly to make repairs.
Now, by 1 p.m., reports reached Napoleon that a vast Austrian army was converging on the French positions. Charles had the bulk of his army with him, whereas a large portion of the French forces, including Napoleon himself, were still yet to fully cross the river. Now, the territory to the north of the river consisted mostly of open fields and some wooded areas. French forces amassed in this area, with their flanks secured on the left and right by the villages of Aspern and Essling, respectively.
Which is on the left and which one's on the right? There'll be a graphic for YouTube, but...
Yeah, Aspern is on the left, Essling is on the right. So Aspern is the first part of the French line to bear the brunt of the Austrian attack. Austrian forces attack the town but are repelled by the French defenders. They then attack again, overrunning most of Aspern, before once again being thrown back when the French sent in reinforcements. Finally, the Austrians pull back and bombard Aspern with artillery before attacking once more. By 4:30 p.m., most of Aspern was in Austrian hands. The French are once again forced to send in reinforcements to prevent the total collapse of their left flank. Now, this fierce, back-and-forth fighting would come to characterize much of the battle.
Now, is Aspern, should I be picturing like a sort of idyllic farm town like that we had a lot in the third and fourth coalition fighting across like fields, or is this more like quasi-urban, suburban, like house to house, like people crouching behind like cover across lawns kind of shit?
I'd say it's somewhere, kind of a lame answer, but it's somewhere in between the two. Aspern and Essling are both characterized as farming villages, but they're both very close to Vienna. I mean, today they are basically a part of Vienna. They were absorbed by Vienna.
But this is like house to house. Like,
yeah, so you do have house to house, yes.
It's probably pretty grimy. I'm
Yes.
remembering Stalingrad.
Now, shortly after the fighting in Aspern begins, the Austrians also attack the French right flank in Essling. Here, the strongest structure was a reinforced granary that had been built to serve as a defensive position during peasant uprisings. The Austrians attacked, were repulsed, and then attacked again, capturing most of the town save for the granary. Finally, the French counterattacked, recapturing the town shortly before nightfall. By nightfall, all of Essling was in French hands, whereas Aspern was still being contested. The French had been bloodied, but they had withstood the Austrians so far. For Napoleon, who's just now able to cross over the Danube, the battle was far from over. He planned to renew the French advance the following day by punching a hole in the Austrian center with the newly arrived French troops. Also, just a fun thing that happens at this point is that two of the French marshals involved in this, Marshal Lannes and the Marshal Bessières, get really angry with each other's handling of the fight. Lannes was commanding on the left and Lannes was on the right and Bessières was in the center. And they actually challenge each other to a duel and almost fight it before Marshal Massena stops them. So that was fun.
Fucking cartoon ass shit. Do you know what marshals were in charge of like each town?
Yeah, so Massena is in Aspern, Marshal Lannes is in Essling, and
those
Marshal
are like all right. Jay, you're the guy. I'm not the guy for all this shit. But like, I remember Lannes and Massena. They have been around the block several times. Like,
oh yeah, I mean Massena's the guy who does a lot. Like, you joked earlier about the Second Coalition, how like the French beat the Russians and then Napoleon comes back and takes the credit. Massena's one of the guys who like does the whole beating the Russians thing. He's been around for a while. And Marshal Lannes is also very experienced. And Bessières is like one of Napoleon's top cavalry commanders. So these are not nobodies.
And this is one of the reasons the French are able to, this is a serious challenge to them. Like, this was a good idea from Charles. This is a strong offensive front against them. But, like, Napoleon does not win alone. He's got all of these guys who are perfectly capable of running a war by themselves, doing relatively small stuff in the grand scheme, right? Like, Lannes, Massena, I'm sure they could be, again, perfectly competent to run this entire campaign by themselves, but they are given their roles, and they are able to coordinate their guys, even if they don't have good commands across the river, and hold and adapt to defeat and retreat, then counterattack, and just do all of that alone before Napoleon even gets there.
Yes.
All right, day 2. The French began the second day of fighting with an attack on the Austrian positions in Aspern at 4 a.m. Again, the fighting went back and forth, but by 7 a.m., Aspern was in French hands. Meanwhile, fighting continued on the right as both sides renewed operations around Essling. After securing Aspern, Napoleon put his plan into action, sending the main body of the French infantry under Marshal Lannes to attack the Austrian center. The French infantry columns were mauled by Austrian artillery, but managed to push through, advancing a mile forwards. That's that discipline and corps structure again. A general rout amongst the Austrian ranks was only prevented by the personal intervention of Archduke Charles, who committed his final reserves to shore up the line and personally rode right into the fray to rally his men. Where has, between like Essling and Aspern, like, where has Charles been this whole time? He's been like kind of holding back.
Yeah, he's been kind of with the reserves. He has his subordinates commanding most of the attacks up to this point, and he's kind of in the center and a bit to the rear. But he will get he will ride right up into the fray at this point.
Now that's very admirable, but maybe I'm jumping a little ahead. But I feel like we're getting a lack of focus. Like, his whole plan was divide and conquer Napoleon's forces. I feel like that means you need to like concentrate, and like he should have picked like Aspern or Essling and like just smashed full in.
Yeah. That's a good point.
All right, so Archduke Charles is there, he's being a cheerleader, he's telling everybody to fight harder. He avoids a full rout, but Lanz's men had made good progress. Unfortunately for them, they're now exhausted. They've been shot at a lot. And to make matters worse, he soon receives news that the pontoon bridge had again been severed. This time by a mill that the Austrians had dumped into the Danube and set alight. That's pretty hardcore, I'll give them that. As the French reserves had still yet to cross the river, this meant that Lanz had little chance of immediate reinforcement. Faced with no other alternatives, Napoleon ordered him to begin retreat back towards the bridgehead. So Charles has held against like a super, Napoleon was like, all right, this is our chance. We have to kill them now. And Charles was able to survive that battering. And it looks like he's going to have a little bit of reprieve.
With the disaster in his center averted, Charles resumed the attack on Aspern and Essling with powerful artillery barrages. Aspern continues to change hands multiple times throughout the battle, but by 1 p.m. it's finally in Austrian hands. Essling only held out thanks to the intervention of the French Imperial Guard, the most elite units in Napoleon's army.
I feel like this whole thing could be a 3-hour documentary.
Yeah, it could,
easily. Yeah. Probably does exist. This is pretty epic.
Yeah. So by early afternoon, it's clear that breaking through the Austrian lines is going to be impossible. With his left flank at risk of collapse and his center and right on the receiving end of Austrian artillery, Napoleon has little choice but to order a general retreat. The exhausted French forces began to withdraw back to the island of Lobau at 4 p.m. Charles, for his part, is willing to let them go, as his own men were similarly exhausted and running critically low on ammunition. Now, during the retreat, Marshal Lannes is hit by an Austrian cannonball in his right knee. French doctors quickly amputated the nearly destroyed leg and carried the incapacitated Marshal past Napoleon. A veteran of the campaigns in Italy and Egypt, Lannes was one of Napoleon's few close friends, making the sight of his injury a bitter one for the emperor. He would subsequently die of infection just a few days after the battle.
And Napoleon knows that he sent Lannes into the heat of battle.
Yeah.
Damn. This is kind of a reminder to Napoleon that men are mortal. In many ways, after all of his victories. It was Archduke Brunswick, right? The guy who got his eyes shot off?
Yeah, that was Brunswick.
All right. Say what you will about the era, but at least this is a time where these ruling class monarchical dipshits have a chance to actually get killed themselves.
Oh yeah, there are a couple of marshals who die in battle. It's a risky job.
I wonder how many times Eisenhower was at a risk of getting his legs blown off. So casualties on both sides of the battle had been high. The French suffered around 7,000 dead, almost 1 in 10 soldiers, another 1,600 wounded. Again, we were talking about how this is not Civ 6. These are, we're talking, man, they suffered so many casualties. Almost 10%. People do not like dying.
Yeah. 1 in 10 is a huge amount for a battle.
So the French have 7,000 dead, 1,600 wounded. The Austrians fare a little better with around 4,300 killed and 16,300 wounded. A thunderstorm swept through the area the following day, compounding the misery for those who had survived the battle. The Battle of Aspern Essling was Napoleon's first personal defeat as Emperor of France, arguably the first major defeat in his military career up to that point. He'd had small setbacks and the Egyptian shenanigan, we can kind of sweep that under the rug.
Yeah, he abandons Egypt before he has a chance to lose, so that's why Egypt doesn't count.
Put an asterisk. But Charles's forces were nearly exhausted as Napoleon's, but he had successfully driven the French from the field of battle and shown that Napoleon was not invincible. Killed a marshal. The victory provided new hope for leaders throughout the great powers in Europe. Now, you'd expect with all of that, lightning battles, we'd be right back at it. But both armies spent the remainder of May and June licking their wounds and calling for reinforcements from across their territories. Napoleon had lost a battle but did not intend to give up the war. He was still in possession of Vienna and still believed the Austrians could be forced into a decisive battle. It must be pretty easy to lick your wounds when you have just one of the great cities of Europe to abuse and sort of I'm sure they're not sacking the place, but they're being comfy.
Yeah.
The Austrians were less certain in their future course of action, but ultimately decided against trying to open negotiations with France. Charles had shown that Napoleon could be beaten after all. Habsburg court was hopeful that the promised British invasion of the Low Countries was on his way. Yeah, both. It's interesting how both Austria and France have somebody coming. I'm sure the Austrians are the British are going to show up any day now. I'm sure the French are where the fuck are the Russians?
Yeah. Yeah. So while the French had failed to cross the Danube, they were still in possession of the island of Lobau. Lobau's, again, it's in the middle of the river. It's where you have a wider stretch of the river from south facing north to get to Lobau. And then you have a very small channel to get from Lobau to the northern bank. But yeah.
It's like the island of Manhattan.
Yeah. So Napoleon turns this island into a fortress, stationing a plethora of artillery, including guns captured from the arsenal at Vienna. Charles, meanwhile, had withdrawn his forces from the immediate vicinity of the river and had taken up position near the village of Wagram to the north. So here, they have to make new plans for what they're going to do. Now, Napoleon is still intent on making his crossing of the Danube from Lobau. Keen to avoid a repeat of the disastrous first crossing, the French began the construction of stronger wooden bridges, and they also planned stakes to block the path of floating debris and patrol the Danube on boats. Now, Napoleon's new plan was for the bulk of the French army to utilize a new crossing that was being established to the southeast of Essling. This force would then towards Aspern and Essling, sweeping away any Austrian forces and allowing the remainder of the army to cross over to the original bridgehead from the first battle. Now, Napoleon's army is bolstered by the arrival of a corps of Saxon soldiers under Marshal Bernadotte, as also you have the arrival of the army of Italy under Eugene and General MacDonald. Eugene had basically marched north after pushing Archduke John out of northern Italy. So when all is said and done, the French army in Austria would swell to a size of 190,000 men and 617 guns.
Okay. Now, on the Austrian side, Charles was well aware of the speed at which the French army could muster new forces. The Austrians, too, brought in new units, though with a total force of 140,000 men and 414 guns, they would be outnumbered by the French. The French have around 50,000 men more and 200 guns more. Seeking to conserve his army, Charles's plan was more conservative than that of Napoleon's. With his men taking up a defensive position near Wagram while awaiting the arrival of Archduke John's army. Remember, John had been pushed out of northern Italy by the French, but his forces had avoided total defeat, instead managed to retreat in relatively good order. Damn, this is the war of orderly retreats.
Yeah, a lot of classic retreats in this conflict.
I will say, I've watched these boys from the first, the second, the third, the fourth, fifth. The third and the fourth coalition wars were just what the fuck are you doing? It was just watching just idiots getting their comeuppance and getting spanked. But here I'm you know what? There's actually some growth here. These people are stupid. No one is competent. But, we've gone from 17 to 27 IQ is what I'll say.
Yeah. So as you can tell, both sides are basically waiting for their respective counterparts in Italy to join up with them. Eugene, who's the commander of the French forces, arrives first. And Archduke John, he's on his way. He's making his way. But so yeah, and that brings us to the second main battle of this war, that being the Battle of Wagram. So this battle begins with the crossing. Now, Napoleon's second attempt to cross the Danube began during the midst of a fierce thunderstorm on the night of the 4th of July, 1809. French soldiers battered against the rain to make their way across the river, first on boats and then on bridges, the final stretches of which were swung out just as the operation began. Napoleon's artillery provided cover to the infantry by opening up a powerful barrage against the remaining Austrian positions opposite of Lobau. Now, as a reminder, the Austrians had mostly pulled back from the river, probably because they don't want to get blown up by artillery. Now, Archduke Charles first receives indication on the night of the 4th that the French are preparing to attack when his scouts notice French soldiers pulling back from other positions along the Danube and concentrating near Lobau. He immediately sent a request for reinforcements from his brother John. John's own forces at this point are kind of still scattered about the Danube, having just recently completed their march from Italy. Unfortunately for the Austrians, the transmission of this message would be delayed due to the poor weather, and it would take even longer for John to effectively organize his men. By the time John's men departed, it would be too late for them to take part in the battle.
F's in the chat, boys. The French continued their advance into the morning of day 1. Austrian resistance was limited to a few units that Charles had left near the river to slow any enemy movements. By noon, these units had been driven off, and the French began their march towards Wagram. Is this Wagram or Wagram? Because this is
Wagram.
Like Krauts. Okay.
Yeah.
Wagram. Great. Sounds better anyway. The location chosen by the Austrians was an area known as Marchfeld. The bulk of the Marchfeld was a vast plain covering the grain fields and home of scattered farming villages. This terrain was ideal for artillery, which would play a large role in the coming battle. Is it still raining? Is that cleared up by now?
It's clearing up. This is the 5th, and the rain is starting to dissipate in the morning.
Okay, so they're going to be able to really use their guns.
Yeah.
At the north of Marchfeld was a narrow stream known as the Rustbach, shallow enough to be crossed on foot, but difficult enough to slow down infantry and cavalry. Running along the northern side of the stream was a large
escarpment.
What the fuck is an escarpment?
An escarpment is kind of like a long hill / ridge. Not quite a cliff, but just a long sort of elevated.
Yo, this is some American Civil War ass shit.
Oh wait, very much.
It's like 15,000 men are gonna die crossing this creek that a bunch of 8-year-olds would normally jump across in 2 minutes. In the blood, the ground is gonna be soaked in blood for the next 20 years. I'm guessing is what's about to happen.
It's not inaccurate.
Because terrain becomes a lot worse when it's been raining a lot and you're being shot at and you're wearing heavy shit and you're tired and that creek is suddenly a big problem. Have you ever gone creek walking, Jay?
Not really, no.
You've never been let's just walk alongside / in this river until we get bored and turn around?
No, not really. Not in, at least.
Yeah, you're fucking weird. So Charles set up his army alongside this ridge, with the bulk of it just beyond the lip, thus concealed from view by the French, while similar detachments held the village closest to the escarpment. So the idea is we're gonna lure the French across this big old field, this Marchfeld, and then we're kind of at an elevated point at the end that they can't really see, and we're gonna light them fuckers up. And when they try and get to us, there's gonna be this creek in the way. Do I have it right, Jay?
Yes, and there are also a bunch of small little villages, kind of along the creek, so right in front of the escarpment. And the Austrians have detachments of infantry in all these little villages.
Yeah, this is across miles and miles, but
Yes,
we're kind of making
this
this
is a big
sound smaller
battlefield.
than it is, but yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So French forces began arriving in the Marchfeld on the afternoon of the 5th. Austrian cavalry charged their French counterparts in an attempt to interrupt their enemy's deployment, but after being repulsed, Charles decided to sit back for the moment, believing the battle would not begin in earnest until the following day. Napoleon, on the other hand, feared that if he did not attack the Austrians that very day, they would be able to slip away during the night. He thus began the main phase of the battle with an attack on the Austrian center at 7 p.m. This is called the Battle of Wagram, just to make that super clear. And it really opens proper at this attack on the Austrian center at 7 p.m. The village of Bommersdorf, that's fun, took the brunt of the attack, being bombarded by artillery and then stormed by the infantry. The Austrians defended Bommersdorf doggedly, preventing it from falling in enemy hands. Another unit of French soldiers managed to bypass the town, cross the Ruschbach, that's that creek, and climbed their way up onto the escarpment before being thrown back by the Austrian cavalry. So now they're like, oh shit, there's guys up there.
So the Austrians counterattack with infantry and artillery, causing some of the French units that had been made up of newly raised conscripts to break and rout. Those units that did not rout were in turn forced to retreat so as to not get surrounded by the enemy. Now to the west of Bommersdorf, an additional attack was launched at the Austrian lines, this one to be carried out primarily by infantry and cavalry from the French Army of Italy, as well as the Corps of Saxon soldiers under the command of Marshal Bernadotte. Now the French make some progress, initially causing a deal of panic amongst Austrian ranks, but again they're eventually thrown back by a strong counterattack. To make matters worse, the retreating Saxons, clad in their traditional white uniforms, were confused with advancing Austrians, who also typically wore white, and fired upon by French reserves.
RIP.
Around 9 p.m., the French launched their final push for the day, with the remainder of Bernadotte's Saxon corps advancing on the village of Wagram itself.
These poor bastards been up since before 7 and it's 9 p.m. now.
The Saxons managed to establish a foothold in the town, but were halted by stiff Austrian resistance. The situation quickly devolved into chaos. Close-range combat in a dimly lit, smoke-filled environment between two groups of soldiers, both clad in white, and both shouting orders in German, being far from ideal. As French reinforcements arrived, they again mistook the Saxons for Austrians and opened fire. In the end, the French were forced to pull back from Wagram altogether.
Alright, that's their own damn fault. The fighting in Wagram would be the last major action of July 5th. The French had launched multiple attacks throughout the afternoon, but had achieved little. They had managed to capture one village, Atterclaw, that helped shore up their left flank. The other offensives had ended in failure. Both sides had taken heavy casualties on the first day of fighting, but neither commander was ready to back down. Napoleon still had reason to be confident. Only a small fraction of his army had actually participated in the combat, and more French soldiers were still arriving at the battlefield by the hour. His plan for the following day was to launch a powerful thrust on the right, with the center and left holding the Austrians in place. For Charles, the situation was a bit more mixed. His soldiers had generally gotten the better of their French counterparts on the first day of fighting, but the French force in front of him was clearly massive, while his brother John's army was nowhere in sight. So things are only going to get harder. Still, the Austrian position was a strong one. If they retreated now, they were not likely to be able to set up a similarly advantageous terrain. Charles also determined that the French left flank had been weakened by the day's actions. The plan he ultimately settled on was perhaps uncharacteristically bold for an Austrian commander. To quote Charles, "I had decided to seize the only means which could give any prospect for success against a superior enemy, namely to fall on them by surprise on all sides as day broke. In modern days, we would call this playing to your win condition." He issued orders for a general attack to commence at dawn. The Austrians still had men stationed on the western side of the Marchfeld, a few miles from this escarpment, that had not taken part in the fighting. These men would now be sent to circle around the French left and cut off Napoleon's line of retreat back to Lobau. It was hoped that John's forces would finally arrive in time to attack on the right. With any luck, Charles hoped to catch the French army off guard, encircling them completely. So we're coming with a big hook to the left, cut them off, crush them. Hopefully the right will be fine, and we're going to fucking kill them. Sound about right, Jay?
Yeah. That's pretty much it, yeah.
Let's see how it goes on day 2.
So the battle would resume at 4 a.m. on the 6th of July. This time it would be the Austrians who make the first move, with General Clenau's 6th Corps advancing around the French left and towards the bridgeheads back near Lobau. Clenau's men made rapid progress, going so far as to capture both Aspern and Essling. While things had gone well for Clenau, the flaws of the Habsburg army would soon rear their head. The ambitious nature of Charles' plan meant that a high degree of coordination between the various units and their commanders would be necessary, but such a level of coordination had simply never been achieved by the Austrians up to that point. Kind of a brief aside, we've mentioned the French corps system before. The whole idea of the French corps system is that you have these army corps, which are composed of infantry, artillery, and cavalry, and also supporting units, that are these permanent formations. So their officers and their soldiers are constantly together, they're training together, and they're experienced, so they can work well together. Previously, armies were kind of slapped together in a much more haphazard manner. The Austrians are transitioning to a corps system, but they're not quite there yet. Yeah. So Clenau had encircled the French, but his men were now very far from friendly units and had a little support, as the other units assigned to support this move failed to follow through. To make matters worse for the Austrians, Archduke John was still nowhere to be seen. Charles' great encirclement was quickly looking like a flight of fancy. That being said, Charles wasn't the only one running into issues with their plans on the morning of the 6th. Napoleon had planned for the French right wing, commanded by Marshal Davout, to launch a powerful attack against the Austrian left, while the French center and left pinned down the rest of the Austrian line. Key to this was the possession of the village of Aderklaa, which had been captured by the Saxons on the previous day. And this is because Aderklaa forms a part of the French left wing. But unbeknownst to Napoleon, Bernadotte had withdrawn his Saxons from Aderklaa overnight without orders, retreating a good way back from the town. In his mind, his men had been badly treated and would be vulnerable to Austrian artillery if they remained in a position so close to the Austrian front.
I mean,
He's not really wrong.
Can you blame them? Weren't they shot at by the French twice?
Yeah, yes.
Also, you're wearing white on the battlefield. That's not a good time. Just fucking go home, man. Put that shit in the laundry.
Yeah. A furious Napoleon ordered Bernadotte to retake Aderklaa, but his men failed to do so and were subsequently routed by the Austrians. Soon the fight for Aderklaa devolved into sort of back-and-forth struggle that had characterized much of the campaign. The regular French forces take the town, the Austrians take it back, the French take it again, and then the Austrians bombard it with artillery, forcing a French withdrawal.
As the fighting raged on in and around Aderklaa, Marshal Davout... Oh, it's Davout. I see. Okay, to me, that's not how Davout is spelled, but whatever. We're not going to talk about the other Davout. Marshal Davout launched his major push on the right. This would prove to be much more effective, with the French forcing the Austrians to retreat from the town. No,
you
absolutely
chose,
not.
You chose to say this paragraph.
Absolutely fucking not. You think Why can't you just put, in parentheses, how you pronounce the shit next to the German nonsense?
Markgraf Neusiedl?
Alright, wait, no, I got this. Markgraf Neusiedl. Markgraf Neusiedl?
Fair enough.
I'm 30% confident that Jay put that in the script as a troll audience. Like, there's no fucking way that's real. All right, so he forces the Austrians to retreat from the town of Markville, but the Austrian lines along the escarpment held firm. That's that high ground we talked about. By the late morning, the French held the advantage on the right and were being threatened by the Austrians on the left and to the rear. The threat posed to the rear, however, was soon cleared out, with French forces being deployed to push the isolated Austrians back out of Aspern Essling. A mass cavalry charge was launched against the Austrian right flank, resulting in heavy French casualties, but successfully distracting the Austrians. With the threat to the rear dealt with, Napoleon was ready to press the attack. Rather than focusing on the right, he would instead attempt a general attack to break the Austrians. Again, Napoleon's doing his thing, which is just fucking punch him in the middle and just get it over with. French artillery was gathered into a grand battery at the center of the battlefield. Remember, Napoleon started as an artillery commander. It was gathered into a grand battery in the center of the battlefield, which had, by this point, shifted to the vicinity of Outbreak and opened fire on the Austrians. The Austrians responded in turn. Bits of farmland caught fire across the battlefield, burning those unlucky to be caught in the conflagration. Great, so now shit's on fire.
Yes. Now, at 1 p.m., the French begin their general attack, with units pushing forwards across the width of the front line. French infantry and cavalry surged forward against a hail of Austrian fire. In the center of the battle, the square of 8,000 men under General MacDonald was ravaged by Austrian artillery before finding itself surrounded on all three sides by Austrian infantry. Within an hour, those 8,000 men had been reduced to just 1,500 able soldiers. While the devastation here was uniquely excessive, French units across the battlefield took heavy casualties in their assault. However, the situation for the Austrians was no better. French artillery had taken a heavy toll, and much of the army was exhausted from the repeated attacks and counterattacks. Charles had failed to achieve his surprise encirclement of the French, and the battle had devolved into one of attrition. Finally, at 2 p.m., Charles received news that John would not be able to reach the battlefield for several more hours. With his men weakened and outnumbered, Charles had little option but to order a retreat to the north. Now, the Austrians again managed to retreat in good order, with the French simply being too exhausted to immediately pursue their enemy. By the evening, Napoleon held command over Wagram, and the battle had come to an end. The Battle of Wagram was the largest battle in European history, possibly even world history, depending on how you want to define battle, up to that point in time.
Wait, seriously?
Yep. Yeah, this was
bigger than anything the Romans did.
Yes.
Is this like... Damn. All right, well, good to the Europeans.
Yeah, this was a violent slog with over 300,000 men fighting in total. The Austrians suffered 23,750 killed and wounded, with a further 7,500 men taken as prisoners by the French. The French had taken even heavier losses, around 27,500 killed and wounded, and an additional 10,000 prisoners and missing. Casualties were high even amongst the upper echelons of the armies, with the Austrians losing 4 generals and the French 5 over the course of the 2 days. And even Charles himself took a bullet wound, like a minor bullet wound in the shoulder.
Damn. So, moving on, the Austrians had once again managed to pull back from Wagram in good order, but Napoleon did not intend on letting them go permanently. The French set off for Charles's army, making contact with it near the town of Znaim on the 10th of July. Now the Germans can stop getting mad at us, and the Czech can start getting mad at us, who are, 2% more valid. At first, it looked like the battle would be a repeat of the earlier confrontations, with the French vanguard engaging the Austrians in an attempt to pin them down. However, as the battle intensified, Charles decided that his army could last no longer and proposed a 1-month ceasefire. Napoleon accepted, bringing the Austrian front of the fighting to a close. Wow. Napoleon accepted. That's probably, like, big for his character arc and shit.
Yeah.
I feel like he wouldn't have done that before this war started.
Yeah, probably
Like,
not.
Being, like, chastened by quasi-defeat, Mons is dead. We said, like what, 5 other French generals are dead?
Yeah.
Shit. Now, with all of the talk we've had of fighting across these farmlands in Germany and Austria, it's easy to forget that there are other places where the War of the Fifth Coalition is going down. Well, the ceasefire at Znaim had brought the fighting between Napoleon and Charles' army to a temporary end. The War of the Fifth Coalition is fully raging elsewhere. The war in Poland had gone poorly for the Austrians. Archduke Ferdinand had captured Warsaw, but Prince Poniatowski maneuvered his army to cut Ferdinand's army off from further support from Austria. The Russians remained in the field, a possible threat to both sides. In the end, Ferdinand was forced to abandon his increasingly vulnerable position and pull back.
Now, back in April, a rebellion had broken out in the county of Tyrol against the Bavarian king Maximilian I. Now, prior to 1805, Tyrol had been the domain of the Habsburgs, but it was given to the Bavarians after the War of the Third Coalition as a reward for their support of France. Maximilian had brought about several political and legal changes, most notably reducing the power of the church, introducing conscription, and imposing a mandatory smallpox vaccination campaign. All of these angered the people greatly. Yes, these are...
And it's kind of like those are all very, like, revolutionary French things to do.
Yeah, Maximilian is like an Enlightenment monarch kind of guy. And also, yes, these are 1800s anti-vaxxers.
Hells yeah.
People kind of forget that vaccination, like, is a pretty old thing. It's older than people think.
And, like, I am a pretty pro-science person, but it's very easy to understand, especially if you're scientifically illiterate, that, like, when a guy shows up with this mysterious juice that's, like, associated with a disease that you don't necessarily want your kids injected with it. Also, the smallpox vaccine originals were pretty nasty, so whatever. Ain't that Pfizer Moderna.
Yes.
It was a lot nastier.
Yeah.
Your arm didn't just hurt for a bit.
Yeah. So basically, you have a pretty sizable uprising in Tyrol. The rebels initially received support from Austria, but soon the French corps arrived to put down the uprising. The rebellion was still swiftly suppressed, with its leader Andreas Hofer being captured and executed by the French. Now, this plays a pretty minimal role in the war, but it does go on to become very romanticized and will play a role in the sort of nascent feeling of German nationalism that a lot of people kind of ascribe their rise to as being in part due to the Napoleonic Wars.
Now, did the Austrians, like, try and, like, help this uprising or plan it going up, or did it just, like, is kind of a coincidence thing?
It was kind of a coincidence, but they did try to help it, like, once it started, but couldn't really do much. Now, after Znaim, Charles realized that the Austrians could not fight on for much longer. His goal was largely to preserve his army as to give the Austrians more leverage in the eventual peace negotiations. Because, like, if they get crushed and scattered and whatever, then the Austrians have no leverage. If they have a semblance of an army left, then, that helps. Emperor Francis, however, still wants to hold out on starting negotiations with Napoleon, in part due to that promise of a British landing. On July 28th, just over 20 days after the Battle of Wagram, the British fleet finally set sail for Europe. Yeah.
Wait.
Yeah.
The Battle of Wagram.
Yeah.
The second big battle.
Yes.
20 days after that, they launch.
This is your classic coalition coordination going on.
The most successful empire of the day, ladies and gentlemen. The sun never sets.
Over 20,000 soldiers, the largest amphibious operation in British history up to that point, land in the Netherlands. The British do quickly manage to establish a position on the island of Walcheren. Walcheren is like it's a part of the Dutch coastline, basically. It's no longer an island because the Dutch did the funny stuff they do with land, but at this point it's an island. But they're slow to advance on their main target, that being the city of Antwerp. This delay allows the French to reinforce the area around Antwerp and basically just bottle up the British. Soon the British, who are basically stuck in the marshy Dutch countryside, began to suffer from what we called Walcheren fever, which was probably a mix of malaria, typhoid, and dysentery, with up to 100 men dying each day of disease. By September, the whole operation was called off, and the British set sail back for England.
Were there any shots fired?
They do, they fight, some small French units when they first land, and they get a couple of towns and stuff. And then they basically sit around and get infected by malaria. Because, again, the Netherlands is half artificial country. It's the result of a large amount of waterworks and irrigation and everything. Because it is incredibly flat and very marshy, naturally. So, in the summer...
Good for the bugs.
In the middle of a summer, a marshland has a lot of mosquitoes, and mosquitoes like to carry disease. So, yeah. The more I read about, the British Army before Wellington, the more I realize, the Americans winning the revolution kind of makes sense.
I mean... we did, the Battle of Saratoga. They got lost in the fucking woods.
And we did River Plate, where they get, beat by the locals in Argentina and Uruguay.
Sun never sets, sun never sets, sun never sets. So, the failure of what could legally be called the British expedition was enough to fully push the Austrians into seeking peace with Napoleon. Negotiations between the two powers resulted in the Treaty of Schönbrunn, signed on October 14th, 1809. This treaty saw Austria give up further territory, including the entirety of its Adriatic coastline, to France, Bavaria, the Duchy of Warsaw, and Russia. What? God, Russia fucking stole in this shit.
Yeah.
Russia fucking made out like bandits. They eating good tonight, boy. Who's the who's the czar right now? Is it
It's Alexander.
God, what a fucking ponce. We did a whole episode on how bad Paul is, but Alexander's just a fucking drama queen piece of shit. All the Russian czars are just super extra bitches, but all for completely different reasons. I love them. The Austrians were also required to limit the size of their army to 150,000 men, pay an indemnity to France, rejoin the economic embargo of Britain, and recognize Joseph Bonaparte as King of Spain. The terms of the treaty were deeply unpopular in Vienna, though in reality the Austrian negotiators, led by Prince Metternich, had probably received more gentle terms than what Napoleon had originally in mind. Napoleon genuinely believed that peace with Austria was now possible, and Metternich viewed France as a strong counterbalance to Russia. Less than a year after the bloodshed at Wagram, Napoleon would divorce Josephine and take Emperor Francis's daughter, Marie-Louise, as his new wife, seemingly cementing an alliance between France and Austria. The cost had been high, but Napoleon had once again waged a successful campaign and come out on top, for now. And France remained the dominant power in Europe, for now.
Indeed. While the War of the Fifth Coalition had ended in a French victory, it also exposed the increasing challenges that France would face going forwards. Napoleon had not managed the sort of brilliant victory that he was famous for. Think of like the great like turning maneuvers in Austerlitz or in Italy. Wagram was less of a tactical masterclass and more of a brutal slogging match to determine which side would blink first. Even with Charles' reforms only partially carried out, the Austrians had fought better than ever before, a clear sign that the other great powers were successfully adopting the French tactics. The Grande Armée was bigger than ever before, but the loss of so many veterans had made it arguably less sharp of an instrument. The Austrians might have lost, but the aura of invincibility around Napoleon had diminished over the course of the conflict.
So, this is an ongoing story. This is not a tight bottle episode, the way I like them to be. But I have to return to where we started. Why does Napoleon keep fighting these wars? Why can he never win peace? And I think it, again, has to do with the threat that he imposes, this existential threat, both in that he is breaking up territory and also that he is threatening monarchical power structures, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that in defending his throne, he showed that he's even more vulnerable, right, this time. And Napoleon is going to try to sew Europe together with this alliance to Austria and this alliance to Russia and just kind of like unite them to attempt to choke out Britain. And I can think of the many pieces of Europe that dominated after 1848, after the 1870s, after World War I. And it's fascinating. We'll, again, talk about it later in our next episodes. Why Napoleon was never able to put this together. And I think a lot of this probably had to do with the fact that he was the guy and he was always pushing.
Yeah.
And he always needed more. And in many ways, his incompetent, foolish rivals knew he always needed more. And they should have done it far, far more competently and smarter. But I kind of went in this expecting it to be like, oh, these guys were so stupid for opposing France. But like, what else are you supposed to do against this guy?
Yeah, I mean,
especially with what he did to Spain.
Yeah.
That's a pretty, like, you ally yourself with France, and then you get evicted from your palace, and a pretender gets put on your throne. And that is a statement, and there's only one way to respond. And with, like, the great lesson of the war, or of the First Coalition, was how powerful France's new military style was. Other peoples can adopt those tactical technologies. And with them catching up and the difficulty level raising, it is only a matter of time before cracks start to appear. I don't think there's really cracks yet, besides the defeat in Haiti and besides the ongoing, what do they call it, Jay, the bleeding ulcer in Spain.
Yeah.
But it's very easy to see why this is kind of the high water mark and why we're going to start to go downhill soon for Napoleon, because this looks just so, even at the height of victory, it looks so amazingly fragile.
Yeah, I mean, this was a very hard victory, and a very hard victory against essentially just one other power. Like, the British did their stupid little thing, but this was mostly just against the Austrians. And it was hard. Like, yeah, the French do win. But it would have been an easier victory, like, it was an easier victory back in 1805. And to me, like, to go back to the point about diplomacy, I think, like, one of Napoleon's great failings is that, to me, he comes off as someone who he's bad at diplomacy, which we covered. I think that it's kind of obvious, but also it kind of gets downplayed.
And what's fascinating is that, hypothetically, he has what's often known as one of history's greatest diplomats do that for him, right?
Yeah, but I mean, if you're talking about Talleyrand,
we haven't mentioned Talleyrand a lot, but
Talleyrand is also
this guy,
kind
his
of.
name's Talleyrand. He's
Well, I was gonna say Talleyrand is also kind of playing his own games. He has his own agenda, but yes. But yeah, I think like Napoleon lacks a good unifying vision for his diplomacy, and he's very often harsher than he really should be. But simultaneously, kind of believes that he can make these systems on paper that will, like you say, draw together Europe. And he kind of just underestimates how much a lot of the European nobility don't want that to happen. And like, you know, the aftermath of the War of the Fifth Coalition can almost seem as like maybe learning a bit of his lesson. If the Treaty of Schönbrunn it's harsh, but it's not as harsh as it could have been. Like Napoleon could have like chopped up the Austrian Empire. He never does that. And he almost, like, you can see like him finally playing the game. He takes a Habsburg wife, you know, a year later. Like that's like, okay, that's what you should be doing. But it's just like this lack of a unifying vision where like at times he'll be much too harsh. At times he'll be almost naive, will really, I mean, we'll see come to undermine him.
And that's kind of a perfect segue into the... Tune in next time on Dragon Ball Z. You got anything left, Jack?
No, not really.
Alright, I have to stop recording to go make my little sister some soup. So, once again, this has been No One Is Competent. You can follow us at Twitter at Azalea Wyatt and at jharrys48. That's with the A's in front of the E's in Jay's name, folks, to make it easier. You can email us at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. I do read those. And our music is, of course, done by the legendary Sam Bryce, who is playing us out at this very moment. Y'all be good.